It was a cold March morning in Vatican City, 2024. The marble halls of the Apostolic Palace echoed with the sound of shuffling feet and murmured Latin prayers. Pope Leo XIV, the 88-year-old pontiff from Sicily, sat alone in the Pauline Chapel after morning mass, staring at the fading light on a centuries-old fresco. Though his health had waned since his second stroke last autumn, his mind remained sharp, burdened, but sharp. A whisper had reached him, not from a cardinal, not even from a bishop. It had come through a discreet letter, unsigned, tucked inside his private breviary. It spoke of Joel Osteen, the Texas televangelist known for his unwavering smile, uplifting sermons, and non-denominational megachurch that filled stadiums. The letter accused Osteen of spreading a message dangerously close to heresy, a prosperity, a gospel, devoid of penance or suffering that drew millions but, in the letter's words, left Christ at the margins. It also alleged he had claimed visions, not metaphorical ones but real divine revelations, that must be examined. Leo XIV, seasoned in decades of doctrinal guardianship, did not act on hearsay. He prayed. For 2 days, he remained in spiritual silence. Then, on the third day, he summoned Monsignor Arturo Galli, head of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. "I want to speak to him," the Pope said, eyes fixed on the crucifix above the chapel door. "Privately, not through the media, and not as a judge, as a brother." The request startled Galli. "Holy Father, this man is a showman, a celebrity preacher. He isn't bound to Rome." Leo XIV closed the breviary with a decisive snap. Then we go to Houston. As the news trickled through the corridors of power in Rome, a quiet tremor spread through the Curia. No official statement was released, no press alert. But within days, a Vatican envoy, discreet and dressed in civilian attire, boarded a flight to Texas. Meanwhile, in Lakewood Church, Joel Osteen stood behind the pulpit preaching on the theme, "Your delay is not your denial." His congregation of thousands applauded, unaware that the highest religious authority on earth was taking steps to speak with him. At his side, his wife Victoria smiled, her hand gently resting on her Bible. To the crowd, it was just another Sunday, uplifting, familiar, and full of promise. But in the spiritual realm, something had shifted. This unexpected pursuit was more than a meeting of minds. It was the start of a spiritual reckoning. What the Pope would soon uncover would test the boundaries of doctrine, trust, and the very nature of divine truth. If this story moved your spirit or stirred your curiosity, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. What's coming next will shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew about modern faith. The spring air in Houston was warm, tinged with the faint scent of blooming magnolias. On the outside, Lakewood Church looked as it always did. A repurposed sports arena, humming with life, surrounded by families in Sunday dress and volunteers handing out bottled water. But on the inside, Joel Osteen sensed something was coming. Something different. He couldn't explain it. There had been no warnings, no scandals, no pressing issues from the board. But in his spirit, a stillness had settled. During his morning prayer, he had felt a heaviness, not fear, not dread, but the unmistakable sense that he was being watched, not by cameras or critics, but by someone who truly mattered. Back in Rome, Monsignor Galli had begun coordinating quietly with the Apostolic Nunciature in Washington, D.C. Protocols were followed, not for a state visit, but for a pastoral encounter. No press, no photos, just 2 men face to face. By early April, Osteen received a formal but discreet invitation. It didn't come through email or public channels, but as a hand-delivered letter sealed with the papal emblem. Victoria opened it first. She read it twice before handing it to him. "Joel, the Pope wants to meet you personally." He stared at the parchment, the seal, the signature. There was no threat, no rebuke. Just a request to come to Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer residence, for a private conversation. Joel had never been to the Vatican. In fact, he had rarely spoken of Catholicism in any depth. His sermons focused on encouragement, purpose, inner peace, and not dogma. He had avoided divisiveness by design. "What would he want with me?" Joel asked aloud, more to himself than to Victoria. "I don't know," she replied. "But maybe it's not about you. Maybe it's about something bigger." That night, Joel walked alone along the edge of Memorial Park. He left his phone at home, needing space to think. The city's lights shimmered in the distance. He remembered his father, John Osteen, and how he had started the church in a humble feed store decades ago. None of this, the stadium, the cameras, the global platform, had been part of Joel's plan. He had simply stepped up after his father's death. "Lord," he whispered, "if this is from you, prepare me, and let me speak only what you want me to say." Back in Rome, Pope Leo XIV began fasting. His frail hands clasped the rosary beads each morning before dawn. He didn't know what Joel would say. He didn't even know what he would ask. But in his heart, he believed that the Holy Spirit was orchestrating something unseen. The world would not know of this encounter. Not yet. But heaven was watching. Castel Gandolfo rested like a quiet jewel in the hills outside Rome, perched above the sparkling waters of Lake Albano. In the early days of May 2024, its grounds bloomed with late spring roses and olive trees twisted with age. For centuries, it had been a place of papal rest, but today it was a place of tension. Joel. Osteen arrived in Italy unannounced to the public. No press greeted him at Leonardo da Vinci Airport. He was met by a driver who spoke little English and offered only a silent nod before beginning the winding hour-long journey into the hills. Victoria had stayed behind in Houston. "Go alone," she told him. "You'll hear better if it's just you and God." Joel sat in silence during the ride, looking out at the unfamiliar countryside. The fields were green, dotted with stone farmhouses and distant church spires. In his lap was the same Bible his father had preached from, leather-worn, bookmarked with sermon notes. He kept flipping back to Psalm 25. "Show me your ways, Lord. Teach me your paths." He thought of the many sermons he had preached about peace, about trusting God in uncertain moments. But now, riding toward the summer home of the most powerful religious figure in the world, his heart was not steady. He felt like a boy again, unsure, expectant, and strangely small. Inside Castel Gandolfo, Pope Leo XIV sat by a window in the Apostolic Palace, dressed in a simple white cassock, no gold, no red shoes, just a plain wooden cross around his neck. The Pope had insisted there be no translators present. He would speak in English, slowly, and listen carefully. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of a small brass clock on the mantel. A single candle flickered nearby, casting long shadows. On the walls lined with dusty theological texts. The Pope's breathing was shallow, but his posture remained upright. When Joel entered the room, he was struck by the Pope's frailty. The man who had once stood tall before millions now leaned slightly to one side, his right hand trembling faintly. But his eyes, they burned with life. "Brother Joel," the Pope said softly, extending his hand. Joel took it. "Thank you for seeing me, Your Holiness." The Pope gestured to two chairs near the window. "Please sit, we have much to speak of. But first let me ask, are you at peace?" The question caught Joel off guard. Not, "How are you?" Not, "Why do you preach what you preach?" But something deeper, something harder. "I think so," Joel replied after a pause, "but I've come to listen and to learn." The Pope nodded. "Then we begin as brothers." For a moment neither spoke. Outside, a breeze rustled the olive branches. The lake below shimmered with morning light. Inside, two men, separated by tradition, theology, and continents, began a conversation that would stretch far beyond their expectations. Neither of them knew it yet, but something sacred had just begun to unfold. The conversation began slowly. The Pope asked Joel about Lakewood Church, its beginnings, its people, its mission. Joel spoke with warmth, describing his father's faith, the early days in the small building on Humble Road, and how they had outgrown it faster than anyone expected. He talked about the community, about preaching encouragement in a world that often felt heavy with discouragement. "I believe people need hope," Joel said. "Not everyone comes to church to be reminded of their failures." The Pope listened, quietly, nodding at times. "Hope," he repeated. "Yes, but hope is strongest when rooted in truth." Joel paused. "Are you saying I don't preach the truth?" "I'm saying truth without love becomes a weapon," the Pope replied. "But love without truth becomes a shadow. We must hold both, always both." The silence between them thickened, but not with tension, rather with reflection. Joel looked down at the Bible in his lap. "My father once told me, Joel, always lift people up. The world tears them down enough. I've tried to do that. Every Sunday." "I know," the Pope said softly, "and that's why you're here." Joel furrowed his brow. "Then what is this really about?" Pope Leo stood slowly, steadying himself with the arm of the chair. He walked to a small table by the window and retrieved a manila folder. When he handed it to Joel, the pastor's hands trembled slightly. Inside were transcripts, pages of printed text, highlighted and marked in the margins. Sermons, interviews. Quotes, years' worth. Joel looked up. "You've been watching me?" "Not watching," the Pope said gently. "Listening. And asking, where is the shepherd leading his flock?" Joel felt the weight of that question settle in his chest, not as an accusation, but as a reckoning. "I've never claimed to be a theologian," he said, voice quiet. "No," the Pope agreed. "But you are a leader, and leaders are judged by their fruit." Joel closed the folder. He looked out the window at the lake below, now silver with the setting sun. "What do you want from me?" The Pope walked back to his seat. "Not obedience, not conversion, only honesty. I believe God has placed something in you that neither of us fully understands yet. But before we talk about the church, we must talk about your silence." Joel turned. "What silence?" The Pope's voice was steady. "The silence around suffering, around the cross, around sin. You speak often of blessings, but rarely of sacrifice." Joel leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in thought. "Is that why you called me here?" The Pope didn't answer. Instead, he folded his hands and waited. The next morning, the sky over Castel Gandolfo was a soft grey, and the lake looked like brushed steel beneath a quiet wind. Joel had not slept well. He had risen early, sat by the window of the guest room, and read Romans 8 again and again. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. He needed peace. He needed clarity. Yet something inside him felt unsettled, not from fear of the Pope, but from something older, a quiet ache, a memory of when the faith had felt simpler, before the cameras, before the criticism, before the constant pressure to say the right thing. Breakfast was simple: coffee, fruit, a slice of bread. A priest named Father Luca brought it in. He was young, maybe 30, and spoke softly. "His Holiness would like to see you again," he said. "Same room." Joel nodded. "Thank you." He looked at the young man, noticing how his collar was slightly askew and his eyes tired. "How long have you served here?" "Just a year," Luca replied, "but I've known the Pope since I was a seminarian. He sees people." Joel smiled gently. "That's rare." When Joel entered, Pope Leo was already seated. This time there were books on the table between them: a Latin Bible, a copy of Augustine's Confessions, and a leather-bound journal that looked worn and deeply personal. The Pope gestured to the journal. This was written by a parish priest I knew in Argentina. He served in a poor barrio outside Buenos Aires. He never published a book, never led a large church, but every night he wrote prayers, honest ones, ugly ones sometimes, full of doubt, full of love. He opened the book and read aloud in Spanish, then translated, "God, today I saw a child eat from the garbage. I felt nothing. Forgive me. Help me feel again." Joel swallowed. "That's real." "Yes," the Pope said. "That's why I kept it. Because I fear that today, in both our churches, we are losing our appetite for truth that costs something." Joel didn't respond. He thought of his own sermons, often joyful, sometimes poetic, but rarely raw. And he wondered silently if rawness would frighten his congregation more than bless them. The Pope continued, "When I was a bishop, I visited hospitals often. I would hold the hands of the dying. They never asked for blessings. They asked for meaning. Why me? Where is God in this? We cannot answer those questions with positivity alone." Joel felt his throat tighten. I've always believed that speaking hope can lift people out of that pain. And sometimes, the Pope said gently, hope means walking into pain, not around it. There was no accusation in his voice, only sorrow. Joel leaned forward. I don't deny suffering, I don't want to give it the last word. You mustn't, the Pope agreed, but don't pretend it never speaks. A long pause passed between them. Then Joel whispered, maybe I've been afraid. The Pope nodded. Good, that means you're ready. Ready for what? The Pope looked at him, deeply, directly. To ask the questions you've spent your life avoiding. Outside, the bells of Castel Gandolfo began to ring for noon prayer. The sound echoed through the hills like a call, too sacred to ignore. After the bells stopped ringing, the Pope stood and quietly excused himself. Let us pause, he said, his voice carrying a gentleness that felt like a blessing. We will speak more after Vespers. Joel remained in the room alone. He didn't reach for his phone, he didn't check the time. He sat in stillness, the silence pressing against him like the weight of water. His eyes fell again on the priest's journal the Pope had read from. The honesty in those lines, raw, trembling, echoed something in Joel that he hadn't named. In years, he reached for the journal and turned a few pages. One entry stopped him. I preached today, but the words felt hollow. I smiled, but I didn't feel joy. Lord, is it still worship when I feel nothing? Joel closed the book, gently. That sentence struck deeper than he wanted to admit. In the quiet, his mind drifted backward, farther than it had in years. He was 19, standing backstage at Lakewood, watching his father prepare to preach. The church was half the size it would one day become, but to Joel it already felt enormous. His father was calm, composed, but that day something changed. Just minutes before walking out, his father had turned to him and said, "Sometimes I'm afraid they're listening to me more than to God." Joel had never forgotten that. He hadn't understood it then. He barely understood it now. Now, sitting thousands of miles away in the Pope's private residence, that memory returned with the sting of conviction. Had he become what his father feared? He thought about the television broadcasts, the book tours, the interviews where he sidestepped controversy and offered comfort. Was it wrong to want to comfort? Wasn't there enough pain in the world? But deep down, he knew the question had shifted. It wasn't about comfort or confrontation. It was about truth, and the truth, real truth, cost something. He stood and walked to the window. The lake shimmered below, quiet and vast. Joel pressed his hand to the glass. "Lord," he whispered, "what have I left unsaid?" Behind him, the door creaked open. It was Father Luca again. "His Holiness is ready for you now." Joel turned, the question still lingering in the room like incense. He followed the young priest down the hall, heart heavy with memories, and the feeling that something sacred was being undone, or perhaps finally rebuilt. As they walked, Joel passed an open chapel door. A single nun knelt alone, hands folded, whispering prayers in Italian. Her voice was so soft it was nearly a hum, yet something about it gripped him. That kind of faith, not performed, not broadcast, but whispered into shadows. Had he ever known it that way? He hesitated for a moment, watching her, then continued walking. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and incense. With each step, he felt a strange paradox settle in his chest. He was drawing closer, not to answers, but to questions, and that somehow felt holy. Joel entered the room slower this time. He felt different, not weary, but stripped. The Pope was seated again, not at the head of the table, but to one side, as though inviting Joel to sit beside him as an equal. "I wanted you to see the journal," Pope Leo said, "not because the man who wrote it was perfect, but because he never stopped asking real questions." Joel nodded. "I think I've spent years avoiding them." The Pope's eyes didn't flinch. "That's a temptation not just for you, Joel. It's common among those of us who lead. People come to us for hope. We forget they also come for truth." Joel swallowed. "You said yesterday that I was ready." "Ready for what?" "To confront the silence between your sentences," the Pope replied. "You speak beautifully. You comfort millions, but sometimes your silences are louder than your words." Joel looked away. That felt true. Too true. The Pope leaned forward. "Tell me, when was the last time you stood before your church and wept?" Joel blinked. I don't know. Maybe when my father died. And since then? I've smiled, encouraged. I've believed I was helping." "And you have," Leo said gently. "But not everyone needs encouragement. Some need permission to grieve, to doubt, to not be okay." Joel looked down at his hands. "If I do that, won't I lose them?" The Pope considered the question. "Perhaps, but if they leave because of truth, then perhaps they never came for God in the first place." The words landed hard. Joel had always believed in love, not guilt. Grace, not shame. He still did. But was he offering people grace for wounds they never named aloud? Was he bypassing their valleys in a rush toward the mountaintop? The Pope continued. "There's a question no one has asked you. Not in interviews. Not on stage. Not even in your books." Joel looked up. "What question?" "Joel," the Pope said slowly, "what breaks your heart?" Joel frozen. The question sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. He opened his mouth but found no words. Not yet. Instead, he felt his mind drift, not to theology, not to platform strategies, but to a woman he met years ago, after a sermon in Houston. She waited in line for an hour to speak to him. When she finally reached the front, she didn't ask for a blessing or a picture. She said, "My son took his life last spring. I haven't been back to church since. I don't need a sermon. I need someone to tell me God still loves me." He hugged her, he spoke softly. But for years he had wondered, had he said enough? Had he spoken words that mattered or only words that sounded kind? That memory flooded him now. That, he realized, broke his heart. He met the Pope's eyes. "It's people like her," he said quietly. "People who think God has gone silent because their lives hurt too much." The Pope nodded slowly. "Then speak to them." Later that afternoon, Earl found himself walking alone in the Vatican gardens. The air was still, touched only by the faint rustle of olive leaves and the far-off sound of a fountain. It was a place carved out for prayer, but Joel wasn't sure how to pray anymore. Not after what the Pope had asked. "What breaks your heart?" He kept hearing it, not as condemnation but as invitation. He had preached thousands of sermons. He had given interviews, written books, prayed on television. But no one, not a single person, had ever asked him that question. And the truth was, he didn't know the answer fully. Or maybe he had known it all along, but had been too afraid to say it out loud. He sat on a stone bench beneath a cypress tree and opened the small leather journal the Pope had gifted him earlier. Blank pages. He stared at them, then slowly began to write. "What breaks my heart is the silence of the suffering, the people who sit in the last row of church wondering if God has forgotten them, the mother who buries her child and walks into Sunday service pretending to sing, the man who can't forgive himself, the woman who prays for a husband who won't come home, the ones who are invisible and think that means they're unworthy." He paused. The ink bled slightly where he had pressed the pen too hard. In the distance, bells rang again. He closed the journal and bowed his head. "God," he whispered, "I don't want to be impressive. I want to be honest." Back inside, Father Luca greeted him with quiet respect. "His Holiness would like you to join him in the chapel." Joel nodded. "Of course." As they walked, Joel caught sight of a painting he hadn't noticed before. Depiction of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus was kneeling alone, the disciples asleep nearby. The scene was familiar, but for the first time Joel saw something different. Christ not only preparing for crucifixion, but carrying the full weight of being misunderstood. He whispered beneath his breath. Even he felt alone. Inside the chapel, Pope Leo waited. There were no words, only the faint glow of candles. Joel knelt beside him. Two leaders, two sinners, two men. They said nothing. They prayed. Joel's thoughts wandered as he knelt. He thought about the people who had trusted him with their wounds, letters he'd never answered, stories he never shared. He thought about a teenage boy who'd come forward after a sermon, saying his dad had walked out that morning. Joel had hugged him, but he couldn't remember the boy's name. Why did that matter now? Because names meant something. Stories mattered, and for too long he had spoken to crowds but forgotten individuals. He looked over at Pope Leo, who had his head bowed, rosary beads sliding slowly through his fingers. A man who had chosen the weight of the world's confessions. Joel didn't know if he had the strength for that, but he wanted the courage, and that was new. If this quiet moment spoke to your soul, subscribe to stay with us. The journey is still unfolding. The next morning was overcast. Rome wore a grey veil that matched the quiet inside Joel's heart. He stood by the window of the guest quarters, watching the street below. Life went on. Tourists walked, bells rang, and pigeons stirred the air with their wings. But Joel couldn't shake the question. It was no longer just, what breaks your heart? It had become, what are you going to do about it? He pulled out the journal again. This time he didn't write a reflection, he wrote a letter. Dear friends at Lakewood, I don't know how to say this. Maybe I never did. But I've come to Rome and found something I wasn't looking for. The courage to be quiet long enough to hear what God is really asking of me. For years I believed that smiling through the storm was a kind of faith. But now I think faith is sometimes the willingness to sit in silence and wait for a voice that isn't yours. Some of you have written to me about loss, others about shame. Some of you are angry at God, at me, at life. I want to say something now that I should have said long ago. I see you, I hear you. More importantly, I believe God does too. I've been afraid of disappointing people. But maybe what disappoints God most is when we pretend to be strong in front of each other, instead of being honest before Him. I don't know what this means for how I preach or lead. But I know this. I don't want to offer hope without truth. I don't want to be a light that avoids the shadows. If I've done that before, I ask for your forgiveness. This letter might never reach you. But writing it has changed me. With love and a humbled heart, Joel. He closed the journal and sat back, drained. There was a knock at the door. It was Father Luca. His Holiness will see you now, he said gently. In the Pope's study, the air felt heavier than before. Pope Leo didn't speak at first. He simply handed Joel a file. Inside were letters, hundreds, addressed not to the Vatican, but to Joel. Letters the Pope's aides had gathered from churches, online messages, and handwritten notes mailed over the years. Joel opened one, then another. He read of a grandmother who lit candles every Sunday for a grandson in prison, a father who forgave the man who killed his daughter, a teenager who wrote that Joel's smile had kept her from ending her life, but also confessed. She wished he would talk more about pain, letter after letter, suffering, hope, silence, and longing. There were stories of miscarriages and divorces, of job losses and addiction. Some were messy, others poetic, but all of them were real, raw, undeniably human. Joel set the file down. His throat tightened. The Pope said quietly, "These aren't fan letters. They're crying. You have heard them, Joel. But have you truly listened?" Joel's hands trembled. He looked at the file again, now blurred through tears. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't prepared for this. But for the first time in years, he felt something break inside him. But not in fear, in readiness. The chapel was nearly empty that evening. Joel asked Father Luca if he could return there alone, and the priest had quietly nodded, handing him a small key. Joel entered the dim space slowly, as though stepping into something sacred, not just because it was consecrated, but because something inside him had shifted. He wasn't the same man who arrived in Rome days ago. He wasn't even the same man who had smiled through the pain for 20 years. The flicker of candlelight cast long shadows on the floor as Joel knelt again at the front. This time he didn't bring a sermon in his heart or a list of requests, just honesty. He whispered, "Lord, I think I've been afraid to need you." There were no lightning bolts, no voices, just the stillness of a man who had nothing left to prove. He continued, "I've spoken so many words, and maybe hidden behind them, but you know what's beneath them. I don't want to hide anymore." A tear slid down his cheek. It landed on the stone floor beneath him. I thought if I just kept smiling, maybe the pain would stay away, for me and for them. But it didn't. And it doesn't. He folded his hands. So I'm asking now, not for a bigger platform, not for favor or blessing. Just give me ears to hear the hurting and a heart that doesn't turn away. He paused, swallowing the emotion rising in his throat. Help me not to be afraid of silence. Help me not to rush past sorrow. Help me remember that even you wept. He remained there in silence, not timing it, not controlling it, letting it be what it was. Eventually he rose and walked to the back of the chapel. As he turned to leave, his eyes fell on a small inscription etched in Latin above the doorframe. Father Luca had translated it for him earlier. In silentio et in spe erit fortitudo vestra. In quietness and trust shall be your strength. He stood there repeating the words in his mind. Quietness, trust, strength not from striving but from surrender. At that moment, Joel felt lighter. Not because the burdens were gone, but because he was no longer pretending they weren't there. The next morning, Pope Leo met him again. This time there was no journal, no lecture, no file of letters, only breakfast, and something warmer in the Pope's eyes. I saw the candle you lit, Leo said. Not for the world, but for the one person who needed it most. Joel nodded. Me, they both smiled. The Pope raised his coffee. To tell the truth even when it costs. Joel lifted his cup in return. To the kind of hope that walks through fire and doesn't flinch. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's rang again, and this time Joel wasn't just hearing them, he was ready to echo them. Joel sat alone in the Vatican guest quarters that afternoon. His Bible lay open on his lap, but he wasn't reading it. His fingers were resting on the thin pages, as if just touching them gave him peace. He'd been thinking more clearly, but also more painfully than he had in years. The silence was broken by the buzz of his phone. It was Victoria. Joel hesitated, then answered. Hey, there was a pause. Joel, how are you? Her voice was gentle, steady, familiar. I don't know how to answer that, he said. That's okay, she replied. I don't think you've said that in 20 years. He smiled, faintly. I've been doing some listening and a lot of unlearning. She didn't rush him. She never did. I read one of your old letters last night, he continued, the ones from before Lakewood got so big. You said something I haven't stopped thinking about. What was it? You wrote, don't forget that broken things. Make room for God. He could almost hear her inhale. I forgot, he said. Somewhere along the way I traded brokenness for polish. There was silence on the line. Then she said, come home when you're ready. But don't rush. Just be real when you do. I will, he said softly. He stayed on the line with her a little longer, talking about the kids, about Houston, about little things that once felt too small to matter, but now felt like lifelines. After they hung up, Joel sat quietly for a long while. Then almost impulsively he reached for his phone again. This time he called someone else, his associate pastor, Damon. Joel? Damon sounded surprised. Everything all right? I think so, Joel replied. I'm just, seeing more, clearly than I have in a long time. There was a long pause. Then Joel asked, how are the people? Damon didn't hesitate. Hungry, for truth, for honesty, for someone to say, life is hard, but God is still good. Joel swallowed hard. Damon, he said, when I get back, I think we need to change a few things. Like what? Like the way we measure success, the stories we tell, the silence we allow. Damon's voice was quiet. We've needed that for a while. Joel nodded, even though no one could see him. I want to start with a message, one I've never preached before. Damon waited. What's the title? What broke my heart? There was silence. Then Damon said, that'll preach. Joel let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Then let's not wait. That night he looked out over the Roman skyline. The city was alive beneath the twilight, but Joel's eyes weren't on the lights. They were on the cross atop the dome of St. Peter's, glowing faintly in the dusk. He whispered a prayer, not for clarity, but for courage. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to tell the truth. The final day of Joel's visit began before sunrise. Rome was still quiet, the streets slick from a light rain during the night. Joel walked through St. Peter's Square alone, his coat drawn tight against the morning chill. The stone beneath his feet was cold and familiar in its solemnity, as if the ground itself remembered centuries of confession and resolve. A Vatican aide met him at the basilica doors, and escorted him through a side entrance. Inside, the space was dim and reverent, lit by scattered candles and shafts of dawn light filtering through the high windows. The basilica, so grand in the daylight, now felt deeply personal, like a whisper from the ages. The Pope was already there, seated not on the grand chair at the altar, but on one of the simple wooden pews halfway down the nave. Next to him was an empty chair. Joel approached slowly. Leo gestured. "Sit." Joel obeyed. No small talk, just stillness. "I didn't bring you here to give you a task," the Pope said softly. "I brought you here to bear witness." Joel turned slightly. "To what?" "To the cost of truth." He motioned toward the empty chair beside him. "This was Archbishop Tadai's seat," Leo said. "He served faithfully for 42 years. He died last spring. But before he did, he said something I've never forgotten." Joel listened, silent. Leo continued. "We built high walls to protect the flock," he said, "but sometimes forgot to open the gate for the wounded." Joel stared at the chair. It looked no different than the others, yet it suddenly felt sacred. "I've seen the wounded," Joel whispered. "And now you must decide what kind of shepherd you'll be," Leo said. "One who maintains the fences, or one who walks into the valley when the sheep are scattered?" Joel looked down. "I always thought encouragement was enough." "It's a beautiful gift," Leo replied. "But encouragement without truth is like a song without breath. Comfort must never come at the cost of confession." They sat in silence for several minutes. The morning light grew stronger, warming the edges of the marble floor. Far above them, a dove carved into the stained glass watched in permanent stillness. Then the Pope stood. "I must go prepare for Mass," he said. "But you can stay here. Let the silence speak." As Leo walked away, Joel remained seated. He looked again at the empty chair and then beyond it, toward the altar, toward the crucifix high above. He remembered every face, every hand he'd shaken after services, every person who smiled through silent suffering. He thought of the stories, untold, the questions never asked, the moments he could have leaned in and didn't, and then he heard it, not audibly but unmistakably, "Feed my sheep." He closed his eyes. There were no visions, no thunder, just peace, and an ache that was finally being named. It was time to go home, but he wouldn't be returning as the same man. Houston was hot and wide beneath a pale sky when Joel stepped out of the airport terminal. The hum of traffic, the smell of asphalt, the distant cries of birds, everything familiar but nothing quite the same. Victoria met him with a long embrace. No words, just presence. They drove home in silence, hands interlocked between them. The house hadn't changed, the neighbors hadn't changed, but Joel's heart, his way of seeing, had. That Sunday came quickly. Joel stood behind the curtain, at Lakewood, listening to the worship rise. His notes were in his hands, but they felt useless. He had written them days before, but now, standing there, he wasn't sure he'd say any of it. The music swelled, then faded. The stage manager gave him a nod. Joel stepped into the light. Applause greeted him. Warm, grateful. But Joel didn't smile. Not because he wasn't grateful, but because what he needed to say required something different. He raised his hand to greet them, and then lowered it. He looked around the room at people who had trusted him for years, not as a performer, not as a brand, as a pastor. He waited for silence, and then he said, "I was wrong." A wave of quiet swept the room. No one moved. He continued, voice slow, deliberate. "I was wrong to think that always sounding hopeful was the same as being truthful. I was wrong to assume that if we ignored pain, it might go away. And I was wrong to believe that encouragement alone could heal wounds we never name." Some people wept, some looked down, some clasped their hands tightly in their laps. "I went to Rome," he said. "I met with the Pope, and I discovered that silence isn't always kind. Sometimes it's a form of hiding, and I don't want to hide anymore." He opened his Bible, not to a parable, not to Psalms, but to Job, chapter 3. The words most pastors skip. He read slowly, voice steady. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Then he looked up. Even this is holy, the pain, the questions, the cracks. He let the words sit in the air. Unrushed, unpolished. I've spent a long time smiling for you, and I still believe in joy. But today I want to make room for sorrow too, because Jesus wept, and that was holy. He paused. Some of you lost. Someone and never said their name in church again. Some of you are angry at God and afraid to admit it. Some of you haven't prayed in years, not because you stopped believing, but because you stopped hoping. He looked around. I don't want this church to be a place where you come to feel better. I want it to be a place where you come to be real. The room was utterly still, and then, slowly, people stood, not in applause, but in understanding. In solidarity, in something more sacred than performance. Joel felt it. He hadn't just returned, he had begun. It had been 3 weeks since Joel's first sermon back, and Lakewood Church had changed, not in size, but in texture. There were more pauses now, more silence between songs, more prayer requests that weren't filtered for neatness. People still smiled, but their eyes carried more depth. Joel met regularly with his pastoral team. He asked them what they were, hearing from the people, what wasn't being said, what needed to be said. He was still learning how to listen. One Monday morning, just after the 9 a.m. staff devotion, his assistant knocked lightly. There's someone asking for you in the lobby. She didn't want to leave her name, said she'd wait. Joel almost asked to reschedule. Mondays were his quiet days, a time to reflect, to recharge, but something tugged at him. I'll go, he said. The lobby was mostly empty, just the hum of soft worship music and the faint sound of a vacuum somewhere down the hallway. Outside, the Texas sun was climbing. She sat alone on a bench near the glass doors. Middle-aged, her hair pulled back. She wore no makeup. She looked like someone who had waited years, not minutes, for this conversation. Joel approached slowly. Hi, I'm Joel. She stood, but barely. You don't know me, but I heard your message, the one where you said you were wrong. He nodded gently, hands in his pockets. She blinked hard. I used to come here, years ago. My daughter died in a car accident, and I came back the Sunday after, hoping someone would say something that felt real. But it was just songs about joy, about overcoming, and I thought maybe I don't belong here anymore. Joel didn't interrupt. He sat next to her, not too close. She looked down. But when I heard you say you were wrong, I sat in my car in the church parking lot and cried for 20 minutes. I wasn't mad, I was relieved. Her voice cracked. Because finally, someone said what I felt. That sometimes faith isn't about smiling through it. It's about surviving it. Joel felt the ache in her words. I'm sorry, he said simply. And thank you for giving us another chance. She nodded. You don't have to say anything else. I just wanted to come back, just to sit. And know it's okay if I don't sing. He looked at her. It's more than okay, you're home. And if all you do is breathe through the service, that's enough. They sat in silence for a while. The sun shifted slightly through the windows. A child laughed somewhere in the children's wing. When she left, Joel remained seated. He looked at the lobby walls, the welcome banners, the polished floors. Everything built to draw people in, but it wasn't the lights or the slogans that brought her back. It was one sentence. I was wrong. Joel prayed quietly, not for answers, but for softness, for openness. Then he stood up. There was work to do. It was a quiet morning in late May when the letter arrived. Not an email, not a phone call. A letter, sealed with the Vatican crest. Joel opened it slowly, seated in his study, the window open to a bright Houston sky. A breeze stirred the corner of his Bible. The handwriting was elegant, precise, personal. Dear Brother Joel, it began, you once asked me why I summoned you. The truth is I didn't summon you. God did. I only held open the door, what he chose to reveal to you, through the journal, through our talks, through. The silence was always between you and him. Joel's hands trembled slightly. The letter continued, I have watched the church for many years. Not just the Catholic Church, but the body of Christ in all its forms. I've seen where we comfort well and where we hide behind comfort. I've seen where we preach grace and where we forget the cost of that grace. You have reminded me of something important, Joel, that change does not begin in institutions. It begins in the voices of those who dare to say what has gone unsaid, those who let God into their confessions. Joel leaned back, heart full and uncertain. The letter concluded, "You may not realize this, but your sermon reached Rome. A recording was sent to me. I watched it twice. Not because of the message, but because of the stillness after it. It is in that stillness that I heard the Holy Spirit move. I am retiring soon. My name may be remembered briefly in headlines, but it is voices like yours that endure in the lives of the brokenhearted. Preach Christ crucified, Joel, but also preach Christ waiting in the shadows, where the hurting often sit. Don't lose your tears. They are the proof that you are listening." It was signed, "In Christ, Leo." Joel set the letter down slowly. The sun had shifted in the sky. Outside, a neighbor's sprinkler clicked on. Ordinary, beautiful things. He stood and walked into the sanctuary. It was empty, dimly lit. He walked to the front and sat on the steps beneath the pulpit, and for the first time in years, he didn't prepare a message. He prayed. He didn't ask for growth, or blessing, or favor. He asked to be made small enough to hear. In the silence, he thought of the woman in the lobby, of the mother who lost her son, of the man who came last week and left during worship, leaving a note that simply said, "I'm still trying." He thought of his father, the first man who told him God was both holy and kind. He thought of the nights he used to kneel beside his bed, back when his prayers were short and honest. He thought of all the people who don't need answers, but accompaniment. He whispered aloud, "Lord, make me less." The room was still. No music, no applause, just God. The story was not ending. It was beginning again, this time on its knees. If this story spoke to you, subscribe and stay with us. You are not alone. Grace meets us